Welcome back. Space may be the final frontier for human exploration, but who should do the exploring? Governments or private enterprise? That's the topic of our tough call today. Government has always run the show, from Neil Armstrong's giant step for mankind in 1969 through the many missions of the Space Shuttle and now the International Space Station. But the $20 million investment of businessman Dennis Tito to hitch a ride to the space station earlier this year has sparked a growing call for private enterprise to have a bigger role in space. So, should private companies take more control of the space program? Joining me today, Charles Vick. He is Chief of Space Policy at the Federation of American Scientists and President of Space Frontier Foundation, Rick Tumlinson. Good morning, gentlemen. Let me start with Mr. Tumlinson, and tell me exactly why should private enterprise have a larger role in space exploration?
Well, actually, I'd like to kind of spin that slightly differently. We believe that it is appropriate for the government to lead in exploration, but it's the next phase, the development of space, the people that, shall we say, follow behind the Lewis and Clarks, that's where we should see the private sector take over. We believe that NASA, for example, should get out of low Earth orbit, get out of the station, get out of the shuttle, and get back to science and exploration and go on to Mars and Europa and all the fun stuff over the hill.
Mr. Tumlinson, you're suggesting that private enterprise should turn it into a Spaceland Disney World and let NASA do the science part of it?
Well, I wouldn't call it Disneyland. I would call it a frontier, actually. I think that having an exploration and science and engineering agency like NASA doing operational activities like building buildings, which the station is, or driving trucks like the space shuttle, is the wrong thing to do. And the poor scientists are suffering. We've got a space station with 3 people in it. It takes 3 people to run it. They can't do any science. We need to get the private sector up there operating these types of things, just as they do here on Earth.
Mr. Vick, does private enterprise belong in space?
It's been there for a very long time, and certainly it does belong there, but we really have to think about what NASA's charter is. NASA's original charter was designed to push the basic sciences, to push the basic technologies, to help drive the national economy and provide for the national well-being and the national defense of this nation. Today, NASA serves a very serious purpose in directing the sciences and technologies in the direction which the government wants it to go for various issues, as well as in support of industry. We certainly see a very great deal coming from NASA spin-offs, and certainly every dollar put into NASA produces much more revenue in return. The bottom line is that NASA is doing some very fundamental work that is very important to the national security of this nation and always has been. Yes, commercial space is there and it should be developed, and there is a point where the ISS program really does need to become a commercial program. And NASA recognizes that, and I think the government does too, because NASA cannot be tied to ISS, but we do have the problem of funding today. And
Mr. Vick, Mr. Tumlinson is arguing that NASA's money is not entirely well spent, and that maybe we can have private enterprise take on some of the, say, so-called building of structures up in space.
That's all very interesting, but, you know, looking at the launch vehicle industry, the free enterprise attempts to create launch vehicle industry to cut the cost of space have consistently fallen on their face since the 1970s. To this day, they're still having problems. Yes, there are bills before Congress to help support them to develop the launch vehicle industry for reducing the cost of payload to Earth orbit. That is certainly a viable task that should be pursued for commercial development. But technologically, I do not think we are really there at this point to be able to truly introduce commercial space to the level and degree that I think is being suggested.
Mr. Tumlinson, we are hearing, though, from Mr. Vick about the issue of national security, and that is a very critical point here. Can we really trust private enterprise to get involved in an area where national security could be at stake?
I'm one of these people who believes the Berlin Wall fell not because we had the strongest military, but because the people on the other side wanted what we have in our free enterprise economy. Rather than seeing space filled with weapons, I would rather see it filled with Americans and people of all sorts who believe in free enterprise and democracy. I think that's the way to deal with the militarization up there. I think that we have to look at our society. It's a partnership between the private and public sectors that makes our society so strong. And that's what we have to have in space. The reason these rocket companies, these startup entrepreneurial firms, and I know many of their founders and operators have floundered, is because they're in constant competition with the government. We had one company where a fellow invested $200 million of his own money to build a rocket, a private commercial rocket, who was basically run out of business because the government pours all its money into two major companies, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and subsidizes them very directly in the development of their rockets.
Mr. Vick, is Mr. Tomlinson being realistic here?
I think he's being realistic to a degree, and certainly in relation to militarization of space, I certainly would oppose that. I'm looking at more of the technological capability of keeping ourselves 2.5 generations ahead of other nations that NASA provides the leading edge for. There's also the issue that, yes, there are companies out there attempting to do this type of stuff. And yes, you would think that we would have learned something from the Cold War when we reduced our aerospace industry down to just a few companies versus a couple of hundred companies, where it's almost like very similar to the Russian Ministry of General Machine Building that ran their aerospace industry, and to a degree in its other forms today is still basically the same. We haven't learned very much, I guess, there.
Charles Vick, I'm sorry, but we have run out of time. Do appreciate it. From the Federation of American Scientists, as well as Rick Tomlinson, joining us from the Space Frontier Foundation. Thank you very much, Den.